Nice meeting you. Because I'm working in okay. We may share some very similar interests. Okay.
Would you like to get some COVID? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, picture. Okay. Ready? One more.
開始啦。
This is going to be live stream.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. For such an important occasion.
I thought we were over.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the launching ceremony of the lecture series Early Encounters Between Europe and Asia, sponsored by Eurasia Foundation from Asia. First of all, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is May. It's my great pleasure to be your MC today. On behalf of the Hong Kong Baptist University, a very warm welcome to everyone here, physically here, and of course also to those joining us online through live streaming. Why don't we give a big round of applause to welcome everybody today? This series of lectures is one of the programs of the 10th anniversary celebration of Xiao Zhongyi Academy of Sinology. The series focuses on understanding the early interaction between European and Asian civilizations and to bring ancient Chinese society into the broader narrative of world history. Now, first of all, may we invite Professor Chen Ji, Director of Xiao Zhongyi Academy of Sinology, to give us a welcome speech. Professor Chen, please.
Thank you, distinguished guests. Professor Shaughnessy, Helena, and Professor Albert Chow, Professor Stuart Christie, Professor Xu Gang, everybody, and Professor colleagues and students. I'm so glad today to be here because a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the launching of the lecture series, Early Encounters Between Europe and Asia. With the trust and generous support of the Eurasia Foundation of Asia, our proposal of launching a lecture series has been granted approval in 2022. I remember that we, including the then Dean of Arts, Professor Matt Viot, were most excited with the news because the theme, Early Encounters Between East and West, will not only expand our research profile in the direction of early Europe and Asia, but also make knowledge accessible to the interest groups in Japan, Korea, as well as in China and Hong Kong SAR regions. The original event scheduled from September to December 2022, although has to be rescheduled and postponed twice due to the epidemic and the compulsory quarantine measures for inbound travelers. The Academy kept on exploring innovative ways to adapt to the online world and laying the groundwork for the new environment that lies ahead. With the staunch support from the university and the Faculty of Arts, today we are so proud to officially launch the 15 hybrid lectures of Early Encounters Between East and West in the coming weeks. Actually, once for a week, we will have a series of lectures, 15 lectures. Now, let's take some time to watch a video about this, lecture series. Thank you. Okay. That's, those are the 15 speakers that were going to be here. So this lecture series is very fortunate in being able to invite so many distinguished scholars from many disciplines to take part in the discussion, who come from their different research methodologies and perspectives, cause us to examine with fresh airs the broader scholarly wisdoms and also emotional awakenings brought about by the interaction of European and Asian civilizations. I would especially like to take this opportunity to thank our first speaker, Professor Shaughnessy, as a world-leading sinologist, paleographer, and historian. Professor Shaughnessy has been a key figure in sinology since 1980s and has made a major contribution in the field of early China through the study of its archaeologically recovered and traditionally received textual materials. He is one of the world's foremost authorities in the study of three ancient Chinese classics, Book of Change, Book of Documents, and Book of Songs, and has considerably advanced the study of bronze inscriptions, manuscript culture, and early Chinese chronology. Professor Shaughnessy is also a long-term friend of BU and many of us, I believe. I can't remember how many times that he visited us and shared his new exciting discoveries on his research with colleagues and students. Thank you very much for your support, Professor Shaughnessy, and a warm welcome also to all of you again. I wish all of you have a pleasant, delightful afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chen. Thank you. Please be seated. As mentioned by Professor Chen, we are extremely honored to have Professor Albert Shaughnessy to be our first speaker of the lecture series. In appreciation of Professor Shaughnessy's sincere support to the university, we would like to invite Dr. Albert Chow, our Vice President Teaching and Learning and Acting Dean of Arts, to present a gift to Professor Shaughnessy. Please welcome on stage Professor Shaughnessy. Thank you so much for your support. Yes, let's smile to the camera. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please remain on stage. For next photo, please join me in welcoming on stage Professor Stuart Christie, our Executive Associate Dean of Arts, and of course also Professor Chen Ji, Director of Shaozhong Academy of Sinology. Let's take a photo to commemorate the event today. Thank you so much. Lovely. One more. Thank you so much. Thank you. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to thank you again to Professor Shaughnessy and our guest of honor. Our lecture will shortly begin. There will be a Q&A section after the lecture for you to raise questions. And it is our honor to have Professor Chen to host the Q&A section for us. For our friends joining us virtually, you are welcome to submit your questions through the chat box function. So without further ado, may I invite Professor Shaughnessy to come on stage again to present the lecture Before the Silk Roads. Please join me to put our hands together to welcome Professor Shaughnessy.
Hey, you have a job on TV. You have all the intonations just right. Absolutely. If I don't sit, is that okay with everyone? I'd much prefer to stand. And I have two screens here, I suppose. We were just sitting back having a cup of tea before coming out, and Dean Shaw said that he's pretending to be Dean. In the same spirit, I'm only pretending to know anything about Eurasian contacts. It was entirely accidental that I should be here. In fact, the reason we're here is because my wife, who's sitting here, is a visiting scholar at Chinese University, and I'm sort of the trailing spouse in this regard. And then when I arrived, May got in touch with me and said, would you speak to this? And I said, I don't know anything about East-West contact. And she said, just speak. So in a matter of a few days, I threw together this presentation. I don't want to claim that it's breaking any new ground at all. And I certainly don't want to claim that it's mainly my work. In fact, I will start with a few things that I talked about years ago, and then we'll move on and report on what other people have said about East-West contacts before the Silk Roads. And I'm going to leave out a couple of really important things, bronze casting. But I hear that 2 weeks from now, Mei Jianjun is going to be here. And Mei Jianjun is the world's leading expert on ancient metallurgy. And so he will certainly be able to fill that gap. And then I was delighted to see, as the video went very quickly, noticed a number of old friends, but then the very last one is my own student, Adam Schwartz, who is going to be talking about language. And that's obviously a tremendously important topic when we talk about East-West contacts that I'm not going to talk about today. So if I can figure out, whoops, there we go. In fact, if I can move around a little bit, I'll be more comfortable. So a map of the Silk Roads. And the important thing in Chinese, of course, we talk about丝绸之路. Lu, is it singular? Is it plural? Is there one road across Eurasia? We know, of course, that from Dunhuang, basically, the roads separated, and one went north and one went south until they rejoined. But in addition to that, we can also talk about various other kinds of Silk Roads that go the maritime route. I'm not going to talk about any of that, but I'll come back to this map throughout the talk, just as a way of kind of orienting ourselves to what the world actually looks like. It sounds like it's a long, long way from, let's say, Xi'an to Alexandria in Egypt. And yet, if you look at this map, it's not that far. How do you get there? You walk. Anytime before the invention of the internal combustion engine, people got around pretty much the same way. Maybe some people could ride on a horse, but for the most part, people walked. So I thought that with that in mind, and since many of those red lines end up in Alexandria right here in Egypt, that we'd start with Egypt. This is just to orient ourselves, tell us that we're talking about Egypt. And this draws on a very short little study. Look at it. It's all of 3 pages long that I published 15 years ago. And that's basically I'm this trailing spouse here, but I'm also supposed to be talking at the other Raozongyi Center at Chinese University. And in fact, I just gave a talk yesterday at Chinese University in honor of Professor Rao. And this was something that Professor Rao specifically asked me to contribute to a volume that they were doing of his journal, Huaxue. And he was always very, very interested in East-West contact. He spent a good deal of time in India, thinking about India and Chinese relations. He spent time in Europe, and he published a number of articles on this connection. And so when he asked me to contribute to the volume of Huaxue, I thought to talk about East-West contacts. And in part, it was inspired by having read just at the time that some scholars in Austria had been using, and so we just talked about EKGs and other what's it called, magnetic resonance for psychological studies. Archaeologists used it as well, and they put a mummy into one of these machines, and they discovered that so I said the received wisdom is that there was no silk in ancient Egypt. It didn't come until Roman times when the Silk Roads were connected. But we'll just skip through that. Sometime before my having published that article, people in Austria published in the very important journal Nature a study about finding silk woven into the hair of a female mummy from the 21st dynasty, roughly about 1000 BC. And what's more, there are 2 different types of silk. There's wild silk that can be found in various parts of the world, but there's cultivated silk, which at this point in time, the only place that it was to be found was in China. China cultivated it, and you, of course, have heard the story that China would not allow the secret to how they produce silk to leave the country, which gave them a monopoly over the production of silk. But 1000 BC, they discovered woven into this woman's hair cultivated silk. It had to come from China. Okay? At least that seems to be quite a reasonable deduction, since there was no other cultivated silk anywhere. So how did it get there? We don't know. On the other hand, just about at the same time, this was actually discovered a few years before that discovery, but in the 1980s, just to the east of Xi'an, there was an early Western Zhou cache of bronze vessels. And I'm delighted to see that we have a bronze vessel there, and we're talking about recasting Zaizhu. And so a little bit of a mention of bronze vessels. This was at a site called Gaojiabao, very near to Xi'an, just a little bit to the east of Xi'an, an early Western Zhou site, which is to say roughly 1000 BC, maybe the first half of the 10th century BC. So, and you can see these two gui are not from the very beginning of the dynasty, but not very late into the dynasty. The second one is quite an early gui. Now, why do I mention these gui? Not because of the bronze at all, but rather because of this impression on the bottom of the vessel. And because of the lighting here, maybe you can't see that very clearly. Let me see if the next one will show up. What they discovered was that on the bottom of the vessel were remnants of papyrus. It was a kind of papyrus that was used to wrap the vessel. Most of it had disintegrated, but some of it actually fused together with the bronze over time. Now, there was no way for the archaeologists to analyze this remnant to determine where it came from, but all they could say was that it was made with the same technique as papyrus was made with in Egypt. It's just a coincidence. There's no smoking gun here that will tell us who brought this from Egypt, or who, how sort of billiard ball kind of connection, one person bumping into another person and into another person and into another person until it finally arrives in Xi'an. But the suggestion is that this technique shows connection between Alexandria, between ancient Egypt and ancient China. And once again, the date, about 1000 BC. This is at least 800 years before what we normally talk about as the Silk Roads. At about the same time, there is some figural evidence of foreigners in the region of the Zhou capital, also from the Western Zhou dynasty. Two very small ivory figurines that were discovered in the Zhouyuan, where the Zhou homeland, probably the site of the earliest Zhou capital was. And they're both, I'm sorry about this. This is a very temperamental thing. They both have these headpieces that were used in Central Asia. And I think you can also tell from the nose, there you go. These are not Chinese people, but they're Central Asians. Victor Mayer, who many of you will know, and I'm surprised that he hasn't been invited to talk about the Silk Road. He didn't want to come. I'm going to refer to him a little later as well. But Victor, of course, has been very interested in East-West contact throughout his entire career, going back to his doctoral dissertation in the 1970s when he was talking about Bianwen coming from India to China and the origins of fiction in the Chinese literary tradition. But he was very excited about this. And he worked with Professor Rao, talking about these two little figurines. And we can't see it here, but on the very top of this figurine is what looks like a Chinese character and is the ancient character for Wu, for shaman. It's a terrible translation. He would prefer magi, a magus, or what we often think of in the West as the three magi. And he wrote an article which I published for him in early China in the 1980s, suggesting that these were not only just foreigners who were at the Zhou court, but actually were some sort of religious figures who were important advisors to the Zhou king. There, too, I think is going a step too far, but certainly the suggestion that there were some Westerners in China operating at the Zhou court who were important enough to have their images produced into ivory is an interesting thing. Want to go back to bronze next. There is a chariot fixture that is in the Shanghai Museum, and it's almost never mentioned, but it has been published by the Shanghai Museum. I won't say anything more about it except have a look at this figure, and of course with probably a tiger over top of it. Maybe that the tiger is going to eat this figure. Maybe that the tiger is protecting the figure, or maybe it's just one of these these hybrid kind of animal-human sorts of figures. But clearly, once again, the figure with the very prominent round eyes, the large nose, is not what we would typically think of as a Chinese person. Once again, I don't have an exact date for this figure. It's Western Zhou, probably mid to late Western Zhou. It's so unusual that we don't have any basis on which really to date it stylistically, but certainly Western Zhou. Once again, just an example that there was some sort of contact going on before the Silk Roads. And just to make sure we all know where we're starting, Xi'an here, of course, and then across the Gansu corridor. One more study of my own that talks about one of the really important cultural features of ancient China. One that people typically talk about as one of the most elaborate productions of the time. Bronze vessels were certainly elaborate, but chariots introduced various kinds of technologies over and above bronze casting. So they involved bronze pieces that were included, but also very sophisticated carpentry, and then not just carpentry, but the training of horses. Horses were at the time wild animals, and even though Americans of my age grew up watching TV westerns, and we thought that you just jumped up onto the back of a horse and rode it like we ride bicycles, horses are not as easy to train as a bicycle. And certainly to get them to pull a chariot. Of course, actually pulling a chariot was easier for the horses than being ridden individually, because horses are herd animals and they like to be together. So keeping them together in a chariot was actually easier, and that's why there was no horseback riding until 500 years or so after the introduction of chariotry. This article that I published in the Harvard Journal, and then published in the very next year in the journal Hanxue Yanjiu in Taiwan. I'll tell a little story about this. So it was published in 1988 in the Harvard Journal. In 1987, we had a conference on Shang civilization at Anyang, and this was prompted because in 1982, we had the first international conference on Shang civilization in Hawaii at the East-West Center in Honolulu. And it was the first conference where we actually had the opportunity to bring together scholars from Taiwan and China to be in the West. Scholars from Taiwan couldn't travel to China at that time. Scholars from China couldn't travel to Taiwan. It wasn't really thought that we'd do these things in Hong Kong until slightly later. But the East-West Center seemed to be neutral territory, and it was also an opportunity for us to bring Western scholars together. Of course, Chinese participants said, 5 years from now, we'll do this again in China. In the old days, I started going to conferences in China in 1981, and when Westerners would give a paper, no matter how silly the paper may have been, the Chinese participants would invariably stand up and say, we should learn the scientific method from our Western colleagues. In 1987, at the second International Conference on Shang Civilization at Anyang, I gave this paper that argued that the chariot was an import from Russia. As soon as I finished, and it's a very substantial paper, it goes on for 40 pages in the Harvard Journal, and it was all written there, all in Chinese at the time. As soon as I finished, 7 people in a row put their hands up, and they denounced me in no uncertain terms and told me that I was a huaidan for suggesting that their chariot came from Russia. No, it did not come. And even though they didn't have any evidence prior to the chariots that were unearthed at Anyang, but they certainly would find it. They would find it. Let's look at some of the evidence. And this, many of you have seen line drawings of chariots. Many of you have probably seen chariots in situ at Chinese archaeological sites. Archaeologists in China hate finding chariots now. Why do they hate finding them? Because it takes forever to actually excavate the chariot, and they all look alike. And so finding new chariots doesn't really add anything to our understanding, and it just takes a long time. So they tend to disregard chariots nowadays. But in the old days, it was a great discovery. And these were discovered in the 1930s by Academia Sinica. And so they pioneered the technique of reconstructing the chariot from the vestiges, the soil vestiges, that the wood, when it decomposed, left in the soil. In the 1970s, in the Transcaucasus region, near the Ural Mountains, a lake was drained, and as the lake was drained, on the banks of the lake was discovered a series of chariots that had been under the water for all this time, and they reconstructed the chariot looking like this. I mean, it was still intact for them to do. The only thing, this draft pole was not there, and so the reconstruction of it was just as a straight line. But of course, a straight line like this it would go to the knees of the horses. So the draft pole had to have bowed up like this. If we compare the two line drawings, we find that they're exactly the same. And in China, up until this time, people had argued that the Chinese chariot could not have come from the West because it was very different from the chariot that had been found in Egypt, for instance. That's true. It's different from some of the techniques are different than what we find in Egypt. But the Lashan chariots here from the Transcaucasus region are clearly the earliest. They're about 500 years prior to the Chinese evidence. So the chariot on the left from about 1700 BCE, the chariot from Anyang about 1200 BCE. And the Lashan chariot is earlier than what we find in Egypt. Chariots there we find about 1300 BCE. So this seems to be the granddaddy of all chariots, and it went south and west and diverged somewhat as it moved south and west. It moved to the east, and it didn't diverge very much as it went to China. People say that's all well and good, but there's some 2,000 kilometers between the Transcaucasus region and Anyang, where the earliest Chinese chariots were found. Is there any evidence of chariots in between? Do we have, once again, that smoking gun that shows the importation of the chariot from west to east? No, we don't have a smoking gun, but we do have pictures all across Central Asia. There are petroglyphs that are left in the rock. And of course, petroglyphs are notoriously difficult to date. There's no organic material that you can do a carbon-14 test on. There's not any related archaeological evidence to use to date the pictures. So all we have are the pictures. But clearly, they come in this period of the late second millennium BCE. So probably prior to the Anyang evidence, probably. And you can see from this that their chariots prominently displayed. And I only have a few examples here. We could go through page after page of examples of petroglyphs showing chariots and showing hunting scenes from this area. So from 1987, when I presented that paper at the second annual conference on Shang civilization and was denounced, until now has been 46 years, maybe 36 years. Yeah. It's now pretty well accepted in China by archaeologists that the chariot did in fact come into China to Anyang from the west. Now, the most recent article that I saw, this is a student of Jessica Rawson's, who now works at the Palace Museum in Taipei, but writing in Chinese. And it strikes me that this young lady was trying to thread the needle of accepting that the chariot was imported from the West, just as most people outside of China have now said for the last 40 or 50 years, but also wanting to have it both ways. So she makes 3 points. That number one, southern Siberia was probably a more important route of importation than Xinjiang. I think that probably is right. These petroglyphs that we find actually go across Siberia, and then we find the examples closest to China come from Inner Mongolia. And so the northern route of importation probably makes better sense than going along what we think of as the Silk Roads of Xinjiang. But then she goes on to say that in the present context of globalization, China's contact with the West in antiquity deserves greater inquiry. What does that mean? We should study this. It of course means that yes, there were contacts across Central Asia, because if there were no contacts, then we wouldn't need to study them. So it's a sort of implicit, tacit recognition that there were these contacts. And then the final thing, I think I'm not doing it any disservice. I'm condensing what she says, but comparisons of China with less developed parts of the ancient world can be constructive. This is something that I'm sure Sammy would tell us that we shouldn't do. Talk about more developed and less developed parts of the ancient world. All this is that it's the same as number two. In the present context of globalization, we should think about contacts across Eurasia, just as connecting Europe and Asia, recasting the glory, sets out to do for these next 15 weeks. Going to move on. those I can make some claim to having contributed something to those 2 or 3 different instances of contact across Central Asia. The next couple of things that I'll talk about, I've had no role in whatsoever. So all I can do is report on other people's work. And I've already mentioned Victor Mayer, someone who spent a good deal of time in Xinjiang. He's, of course, famous not just for studying the Dunhuang Bianwen, but also for studying the mummies of Central Asia. And he published a book 15 years ago, together with J.P. Mallory, on the mummies and the earliest people from the West. I don't want to say very much. This would have been his opportunity to come and give you a full-fledged lecture on this. In fact, he probably would come and give you a course for an entire semester talking about it. But just a couple of examples of the mummies. So these mummies, because they're from Central Asia, where it's incredibly dry, the same kind of arid conditions that we find in Egypt, so that they're perfectly well preserved. Not just the people and the faces. We're going to see that some of them had blonde hair, reddish hair, blue eyes. So they're clearly Caucasian. Also, their clothing, to a large extent, has been preserved intact. And this is the same kind of clothing that we see across Central Asia. For instance, at the famous site of Pazyryk, that was frozen in the ground, and then because it was frozen, everything was preserved perfectly. The clothing is just the same. Actually, there's also the famous beauty of I forget the name of the site, but just as an example, that these people, once again, the big round eyes, the big nose. Central Asian. I'll leave it to Victor if ever you get the chance to bring him to Hong Kong again to talk about this. But what I want to spend a little bit more time with is the later period, just before the establishment of the real Silk Roads. And this is probably one of the real spurs to the Silk Road. So we have the Parthenon on the left, and the bronze ding representing China on the right. The Parthenon from 5th century BC in Greece, a little bit later than that. We know that Alexander the Great conquered much of the world in just a few years, right? And in the 320s BC. What are the 320s? We'll keep showing you this map, but we should probably also show you a timeline. The 320s are when Mencius was talking with Liang Huiwang, right? That probably the time that Zhuangzi was on the Hao River, looking at the little fish floating around and talking about Yu Zhile. So just to sort of orient in time the two different cultures. And Alexander made it east as far as modern day Afghanistan. And he established cities where he went. He died at the age of 23, but before he did, he took Greek culture a long way, and some of his generals remained on in Central Asia. So another article that I want to just report on, which certainly was very influential in my own thinking about that article for Professor Rao back in 2008, was this one by Richard Barnhart, published in a big fat book of essays about archaeology, but given just the very suggestive title of Alexander in China ? Well, Alexander didn't make it to China. We know that. But he got pretty close. And maybe even though he didn't make it, some things that he brought along with him did make it. And Barnhart focused on one aspect in particular. He was talking about tombs that had been discovered in the 1980s in Hebei, Pingshan. This is the Zhongshan Wang tombs. That were pyramids. Well, in North China, pyramids hadn't been used for burials prior to that. All the burials prior to this time were just shaft burials in the ground. Famous tomb at Anyang, for instance, Fu Hao's tomb. Over top of it, there was almost certainly a temple of some sort of a building, but certainly not one of these pyramids. There were mounded tombs in the Yangtze River Basin. Why were there mounded tombs in the Yangtze River Basin? Because the water table is very high, and so if you dug a grave, it would fill with water, and so people tended to bury on the south side of the Yangtze, bury people on the ground, and then put a little mound of rocks over it. But what we're talking about in Pingshan is large pyramids. And the date of these is the 310s BC. Some of you will doubtless know about this tomb. There's actually a kind of an architectural drawing of the entire cemetery area that is done in bronze. And this is what the archaeologists have reconstructed from that it would have looked like. But these are not just buildings, but they're actual sort of pyramids with a building structure on the very top. So why did Dick Barnhart make a big deal out of this? It's the first time we've seen anything like this in the Chinese case. Where did it come from? Well, as Alexander was leaving Greece, just before that, one of the wonders of the ancient world was the tomb of King Mausoleus that was in Turkey. And the tomb of King Mausoleus was built in the form of a pyramid with structure on top. And this is not just these are not like the pyramids from ancient Egypt in the second millennium, but rather much closer to Greece. And it's the word that gives us in English the word mausoleum, which is taken from Mausoleus's name. And Barnhart makes the suggestion, and it seems reasonable to me, that the whole notion of putting tomb mounds over the tombs of kings could have been brought from Turkey across Central Asia and eventually made its way to this northern Rong population at Zhongshan. You know, that Zhongshan was supposed to have been a non-Chinese state, even though it was set right in the middle of all Chinese states. And if you've been to Xi'an, you've also doubtless been to Lintong and seen the tomb of the first emperor. The tomb has never been opened, as far as we know. Used to be that you could just walk right up to the top of the tomb. Now there are walls all around it and you can't get in. But it too is a pyramid, very clearly a pyramid. It's 100 years after the tomb of Zhongshan Wang Cuo, which was again about 315 or so. Tomb of Qin Shi Huang, 210 BC. When we think of the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, we don't usually think about this pyramid, but rather we think about the terracotta warriors. Let me just go on here. And for this, I want to draw on a series of studies by a art historian, archaeologist who now teaches in Vienna, Lucas Nickel. When he was writing these, he was still teaching at the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. But he's published articles in his own native German, in Chinese, and in English on the first emperor in sculpture. And so I want to be very clear that I'm just stealing from Professor Nichols' study for these kinds of comparisons. So the terracotta warriors are very famous, but also very famous because nobody knew where they came from. Nobody had seen any statuary at all in China prior to this time. Now, we know that Confucius talks about burying young in tombs, right? And that even though we're no longer practicing human sacrifice, but by virtue of putting these little mannequins in the tomb, that it shows that we still have this sort of bloodthirsty notion of sacrificing people together with them. So there must have been statues of a sort, but we don't have anything like these full-size statues here. This is one of the first pieces that Lucas Nicol presents in his study. We could come up with scores of similar kinds of statues from Greece in the period from the 5th to the 4th century BC, period leading up to Alexander the Great, leading up to the 3rd century BC when we have the tomb at the Qin Shi Huang's tomb at Lintong. So a little bit later than that, a charioteer, which, just putting things side by side, as art historians tend to do, the connection is pretty hard to discount. In this case, I think the Chinese expression that a picture is worth 10,000 words is correct, and so I should shut up. The picture speaks for itself. Facial expressions. One of the things that we know is that the 6,000 terracotta warriors at Lintong were made in a kind of composite structure. So they weren't all individual, but the faces tended to be individualized. Where did that come from? If you look at facial expression prior to the late 3rd century BC in China, there just aren't any precedents for it. So if we look at this obviously Greek-inspired head found in Uzbekistan, inspired, probably influenced by Alexander's presence, certainly much later, but with an obvious Greek connection. And then putting the two together, once again, it's very hard to discount the influence from one to the other. And of course, if there's influence, it has to go from the West to the East. There's nothing in China that could be said to have predated the Greek examples, and so suggest that the influence went in the other direction. More recently, so Lucas Nicol makes the point that the 6,000 soldiers in Pit 1 and actually in Pit 2 as well at Lintong they don't show any kind of modeling of the human body, because they're all clothed and they have military uniforms on them, so that in fact the internal structure of the statues is just sort of flat. So there's no sense of a kind of human body really under it. The human face, to be sure, but the body, the muscles, the sinews, they don't show. The belly doesn't show at all. But there was a pit more recently in the early 2000s that was discovered with 12 acrobats. These are bronze acrobats, and they're not clothed. So you can see, that he has just a loincloth on him, which means that the sculptor was required to display the human body. And here you can see there's more of an effort to display the body in all of its characteristics. And if we just compare these two, again, there's the suggestion, at least, that there's an influence from one to the other. And then wanted to show this because this was found much more recently in Afghanistan. So right on the border of China, there was a Greek city that was unearthed. And the trouble with photographs like this is that you can't tell how big this is. You would think that this is a full-size statue, when in point of fact, it's only 40 centimeters high. But it certainly models the human form. And if we compare it with one of these wrestlers who was among the 12 bronze figurines found at this pit in whatever the number is at Lintong, you can see some connection there. I don't want to say any more than that because this is not my work. But if you read the article by Professor Nickel, it's hard to deny the connection. And then an article by Lin Meicun that talks about this particular figure that was found in Xinjiang. Okay, Xinjiang. I guess now in Hong Kong, we have to say that Xinjiang is part of China. Some of us would still resist, but certainly it's very close to the Chinese heartland. And it's from the 4th, somewhere around 300 BC. And this figure, you can see from the headpiece and these sort of ear flaps, this was the kind of helmet that a Greek hoplite wore in battle. So it's clearly Greek influenced, and the face, once again, with the big round eyes, probably a prominent nose, does suggest that this was part of some sort of a Greek settlement that was there right on the border of what we think of as, well, in fact, within the borders of present-day China, on the border of what we think of as the Chinese heartland. So, Westerners on the Silk Roads, we've gone from 1000 BC, this magician here, the magus, Victor Mayer also argues is the origin of the English word magician. The chariot fitting, the bronze chariot fitting, maybe about 9th century BC, between 900 and 800 BC. Down to this figure about 300 BC, just a little bit further to the west from Xi'an. We move off to Xinjiang, these two figures, and then in Afghanistan, a figure such as this are all evidence of this kind of a contact. So I have pretended long enough now that I actually know anything about this topic. It was really an excuse to see old friends and to come back to BU, which is one of my very favorite places in all the world. So it's a delight to be here with you today to share just a little bit of what I know about the topic. So thank you very much for listening, and let's have questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaughnessy, for this very interesting and inspiring talk. Now it's come to the time for Q&A. Let me take some questions from floor. We have some audience from the online, and we have 180 about audience. So we can also take some questions from the audience online. Okay, please, Professor. Yeah.
I just try to ask, do we have a wild guess about I call it the 5-point star civilization? Because the 5-point star basically is over to the west in China and also to South America, something like that. So how come the 5-point star is so widespread all over the world? Just a wild guess, because no one knows it currently.
Simple answer, I don't know. Honest, I don't believe in contacts across the Pacific. So there is a kind of cottage industry in China, and also picked up a little bit in the United States, that sees the Olmec civilization as being inspired by the Shang civilization. And the argument is that the land bridge across the Bering Strait was still something that could be walked across as late as about 1000 BC. And people would have gone from Anyang walking. And I've even seen arguments that it was at the fall of the Shang dynasty in 1050 BC, roughly, that Shang Yimin sort of left and walked across Korea and then up across the Bering Strait and down Alaska and all the way to Mexico when they finally found some warm weather. And I don't believe that. What we also see are across the American Southwest petroglyphs that American Indians carved into the stone. And there are people who say that these petroglyphs look like Shang oracle bone inscriptions. And indeed, there's even one man in America who's published several articles and even a book claiming that he can read them according to their Chinese translation. I don't find it at all persuasive. There clearly are long contacts across Asia and the Americas, but these go back 15,000 years, not, I think, in historical times, not the last 1,000 years. So contact, 5-point contact, 5-point star, I just don't know.
Questions?
Hello, Professor Shaughnessy. 你好. I want to ask, apart from cultural interactions or commercial interactions, does the contact across Eurasia include any religious activities? As we know in the 左传, Zhuo tradition, it is recorded that 神不心非类, 民不似非族, which describe spirits do not relish sacrifices from those not of their kind, and the people do not offer sacrifices to those not of their clan. Under this notion, is religious transmission very difficult between different countries, not only between Europe and Asia?
你好. A very good question, big question. The quotation from the 左传 is often used, but it's used to buttress different kinds of arguments. I once had occasion to debate with some Chinese colleagues over the actual usage there, because the Zhouyuan oracle bone inscriptions seem to include sacrifices to the Shang ancestors. So some Chinese scholars point to the 左传 quotation and say, this could not be Zhou people sacrificing to the Shang because, you don't sacrifice to a different Zhu. In fact, we find all sorts of examples of sacrifices from one family to another family in ancient China. And these are political considerations rather than ritual considerations. So I don't think, even within the Chinese context, that particular quotation is very persuasive. It certainly indicates that there was a belief in this, that you ought not to do it. But when there's a belief that you ought not do something and you enunciate that, probably it means that there are people who are doing it and that they're to be criticized for that. In terms of contact across Central Asia, in terms of religion, I've mentioned in the talk that Professor Mayer thinks that these magicians, the little ivory figurines, were magicians who were brought to the Zhou court, and of course the word Wu with a cao zitao, not a zhu zitao, is the word for to divine, and that maybe they had something to do with divining at the court. There's no evidence for that, and certainly we know that Chinese divination techniques had been around well before 1000 BC. Another argument, much broader argument that has been made for probably 100 years or close to 100 years now, is that the Zhou notion, so Zhou stands for the West, right? And Shang stands for the East. And so the Zhou connection with the West somehow introduces a new religion to China, whereas the Shang had sacrificed, not quite sacrificed to, but held Shangdi as its high god. The Zhou replaced Shangdi with the cult of Tian, heaven. All across Central Asia, the cult of Tengri is the main religious symbolism of Central Asia. And people have introduced linguistic evidence that Tengri and Tian are related. I don't have the linguistic knowledge to be able to evaluate that kind of a claim, but it's certainly a claim that many people have made for almost a century now. And there does seem to be some sort of broader religious connection, if not a linguistic connection. So those kinds of elements do suggest a broader contact. In a very early article that I published in Professor Mayer's Sino-Platonic papers, I suggested too that the Zhou notion of a 7-day week seems to have no precedent within China, but certainly the 7-day week was used in the West and may have come in together with a whole sort of a nexus of these kinds of cultural notions, the chariot, and various other kinds of artifactual evidence, and then also sort of linguistic and conceptual themes as well. The 7-day week, of course, died out after the Western Zhou, and we have a little bit of evidence throughout medieval China that people were thinking that the moon can be divided into 4 equal portions that are about 7 or 8 days each. But in the Western Zhou, it was the way that the time was really divided. Where did that come from? So, okay.
Thank you. So I think that there are maybe some key evidence for the arrival of Indo-European people, 印欧人, from Near East or maybe Middle East to the Asian China. That is, that is some bones that was discovered in Yin ruins, Yin Xu. The DNA of them was analyzed, and the professor Tang Jigen and his team found that these bones were maybe belongs to Indo-European people. So I think that the result is beyond many historians' imagination, and especially scholars who focus on the maybe classical text. So my question is, as a scholar who focus on the text, do you think the analysis of DNA or maybe other technologies are helpful about studying about the cultural communication in maybe the pre-Silk Road area? So that's my question. Thank you.
Again, a wonderful question, for which, so you asked me as a historian of text, rather than as an archaeologist, how I would respond to that. So I can respond. I think that DNA has been used by archaeologists now for about 30 years, and is still pretty much in its infancy in terms of being able to really produce reliable results. So I know the Tang Jigen's study that the DNA suggests that there's some sort of a Western component. Much more persuasive is the evidence from Qin Shi Huang's tomb that there have been Western people who have been discovered there. Anyang, of course, 1,000 years earlier. I wouldn't discount at all that there were Westerners or people who were sort of interbred with Caucasians at Anyang. I think that DNA, when it's finally developed to its fullest, will be able to tell us much more than just these kinds of connections across broad populations. At its best, it's going to tell us what people ate, how healthy they were, things like that. But this too is something for which I have no control in terms of just my own knowledge base. So I do try to follow some of the evidence, and certainly read Tang Jigen's reports. I think it's interesting and worth commenting that Professor Tang, of course, studied in England. He got his PhD at Cambridge, I believe, the SOAS, that these kinds of connections I've been talking today from Egypt to China, the Silk Roads, but these Silk Roads, it's not just the Belt and Road Initiative that continue, but much more important are the sort of intellectual connections from east to west and west to east. So Tang Jigen is a perfect example. Mei Jianjun, who you're going to have in 2 weeks, is a perfect example of the kind of results that can be produced when we actually engage in these east-west connections. So I think this is a very inspired set of lectures that the Raozongyi Academy of Sinology has suggested for us. And I for one, look forward to the next 14 lectures, from which I hope to learn a great deal.
I think 14 is not enough. Probably we will continue this lecture series after this 14. And to be fair, I need to take some questions from online, participants, because we have a lot of participants there. One question is about, maybe it's about the mass production of the Eastern Zhou bronze coins and bronze seals and bronze mirrors. Why is that? Are there any clues that they're from Western origin? You find anything?
Mass production of Eastern Zhou bronzes. I don't know that anyone really talks about that. It could be. What people are more interested in terms of Eastern Zhou bronzes is the lost wax casting. Of course, bronzes in ancient China prior to the Eastern Zhou were produced in piece molds and not with the lost wax technique, which was used in the West. But already beginning in about the mid-6th century BC, we begin to see evidence of lost wax casting. And certainly when we get, for instance, to the Zhenghe tomb in 433 BC, there's good evidence for lost wax casting then. But it never fully replaces piece mold casting. And there are some suggestions that lost wax casting, because it was the standard technique of the West, would have been brought into China. But I don't know anything about that. I just read Jessica Rawson's newest book, Life and Afterlife in Ancient China, and she, it's a little amusing to me that when I was editing the Cambridge History of Ancient China, and Dame Jessica was contributing to it, she was very interested in the southern connection. So the connection that came from the lower Yangtze and then through Sichuan, and then in the back door, so to speak, from Chengdu up to Baoji in Shanxi province. But in this book, she has changed her orientation. I think it's about 270 degrees. Now everything is Central Asia. All of the contacts. And she does talk about bronze casting in the Eastern Zhou. And I don't think, though, she's making the claim that lost wax castings comes from the West, but it had to come from somewhere.
Thank you. Another question is quite tricky, I think. If petroglyphs are hard to date, then how are the petroglyphs dated?
Yeah.
And what technique was used?
So I'm not an archaeologist. I just read what archaeologists write, and to a certain extent have to take their conclusions on faith. To a certain extent. I mean, I don't take anything on faith really, but the arguments are that these have related cultures across Central Asia that are that date to this period. I don't really understand just how. The one sort of figural example from Inner Mongolia is on a piece of wood, and that's easier to date. And that's from about 900 BC, I think it is. So not the period prior to Anyang, but certainly suggests that it's a very early example of a figural chariot. So just a representation of a hunting scene. But it's a good question. How do we, if it's hard to date, how do we date it? I can't answer it. Sorry.
Thank you. Because of time, we can take one final question. Oh, sorry. Travis, I think.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on the question on your ideas on Zhou as a kind of a Western civilization within China, because I recently got quite interested in their thought to be ancestor Houji, Lord of Millets. And it was said that he introduced wheats and barleys from the West. And I kind of think that is they maybe this figure, this kind of demigod figure, represent a group of people from even further west of the Zhou and introduce these farmable crops to China. So are you aware of any agriculture related archaeological studies that talk about this this East and West context in terms of crops? Thank you.
Thank you. You gave me the opportunity to push another book that I recently read and of which I'm a great fan. It's called The King's Harvest by Brian Lander. And it's a study of the Guangzhou area from about 5000 BC to 221, to the Qin conquest. And it's how the environment changed over time, but especially with the kinds of crops that were brought in. He also has a number of specialized studies on the introduction of such things as wheat into China that was much later than we would normally think, probably towards the end of the second millennium BC that wheat came in, and roughly at the same time as the chariot, surprisingly enough. So Houji, of course, the G there is millet, which was grown in China always. But wheat and a couple of other crops came in. Sheep and cattle seem to have come in also over the course of the second millennium BC. So rather later than we would normally have thought. But if I can just encourage everyone to look at this book, it was published, I think, just last year or maybe 2 years ago, The King's Harvest by Brian Lander. It won the James Henry Breasted Award of the American Historical Association last year for the best book in pre-modern history in the world, not for China, but in the world. It's really a wonderful book. And indeed, many of Brian Lander's studies, I think, are really important. And it's sort of the same kind of question as DNA. These are things that people like me don't pay any attention to, right? spend our lives reading text, but there are all sorts of other ways to get into contact with the ancient world. And if we always think that people lived within their environment, and that environment always changed, and they had an interaction with the environment, I think it will lead us to new conclusions about what ancient life was like.
Hey, thank you so much, Professor Shaughnessy. And I think many times, almost all the time, when we invite Professor Shaughnessy here, the time is always not enough for us to. Okay, so but we have to conclude here for this time, and also I would like to thank you for your participation, and also for the participation of our audience online as well. Please join us to give Professor Shaughnessy a big applause, and thank you for your very interesting, inspiring, and informative talk. Okay, thank you.